Thank you so much for the invitation from the Northstar. Thank to Noah and Hans, especially for making this event quite an exciting one. As you can notice, I mean, the LSE is quite diverse in terms of global kind of characteristics. So our students come from more than 150 countries, as you may realize. And also the staff members come from all different countries. So Hans comes from Germany, Kent, I'm not sure whether you're British now or come from China. I come from South Korea, by the way, so just to acknowledge my nationality as a way of showing that's where I come from. That's the region, the Asia, East Asia as a whole has been the region that I've been studying so far as part of my research. So I've been doing research on East Asian cities for the last 15 years or so, and that also includes Chinese cities as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is really about some of the major characteristics of China's urbanization and what Chinese cities look like and how they come about to exist in the way that you see nowadays. So 15 to 20 minutes at the most will be the time I'm given. Obviously not enough to talk about this entire body of literature, research findings about Chinese cities. So let me just kind of highlight some of the key aspects which kind of include the major characteristic of the urbanization, being the major political and ideological project of the state in contemporary China, and also the importance of fixed asset investment in making Chinese cities, and at the same time how land is so important for Chinese government to finance development taking place in China. And before concluding some discussions about the role of the state, the Chinese local state in particular. And I leave the rest of the talks or other items for further discussions if we have time for Q&A. So I think just one quick remark to make will be the urbanization rate in China, which has gone over 50% as of today. But it will be also interesting to see how the importance of year 2011, which is actually the official year in terms of the official estimation of the urban population in the entire national population in China. The year that China has seen more urban residents, officially speaking, in terms of urbanization rate. So here, after year 2011 is the kind of landmark year for China, and of course, there are all sorts of controversies in terms of estimating how many people are actually living in China, Chinese cities, and there's always the issue of how the counting has been done in an accurate way, and whether or not the migrants are really captured in this estimation and so on. But nevertheless, the official estimation becomes one important aspect to look at. Why is it important? It's largely because when you look at the new leadership which came into power at the end of 2012, Li Keqiang and Xi Jinping and so on, one emphasis they made was we'll keep on pursuing the urbanization drive in order to raise the urbanization rate of 50% to about 70% by year 2030, and the middle ground, where the milestone by 2020 to be 60% urbanization rate, which also means they are going to have additional 300 million urbanized by 2030. It doesn't necessarily mean they are going to bring more migrants to existing cities. That will be part of it. Also, it will also mean all these major cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and so on are quite saturated in terms of residing population, and they are going to have all sorts of population sorting, so that they kick out the unskilled migrants or all those people or industries which are meant to be in a lower tier part of the industrial structure, and so on. They kind of driving these people out, away from the city centers and inviting more skilled migrants, the university graduate who kind of return from abroad after having studied in other countries like the US and so on, or the other experts and so on. But the additional 300 million people will be very much centered on those small or medium-sized cities, which are meant to be growing even further, where there are more rooms to accommodate more migrants. But at the same time, the whole political drive to have urbanization is also accompanied by this urbanization as an ideological project, or the urban being the most desired status quo for living. So when you look at one interesting slogan, which comes from the Expo 2010 in Shanghai. The Expo itself was having the theme of the city living as the main theme, and which kind of coincides quite well with what China has been seeing nowadays. But when you look at the English slogan, better city, better life, the official slogan in English actually kind of tells you, this kind of some common sense knowledge, better urban management, better infrastructure, and so on, better living environment will bring better life to urban residents. If anyone speaks Chinese or recognizes Chinese characters, you may see a bit of difference between the two. Just the Chinese slogan adopted at the time of the Expo in Shanghai. It actually means city makes your life happier. There's no indication of better city whatsoever. It's just a city makes your life happier. It kind of captures the essence of what the Chinese leadership or the Chinese society has been seeing or has been forced to see in contemporary period. So you have to kind of hold emphasis on being a citizen or being an official resident in a city, being the more desired status quo in comparison with, so for example, the migrant workers who come to cities from rural counties and villages. Where all this urbanization drive comes very much with this heavy investment in fixed assets. So when you look at the Chinese government statistics, for example, we have whole interesting array of numbers which kind of show how much investment goes into expanding the so-called fixed assets, which include the infrastructure investment, the building airports, motorways, or the high-speed rail connections, and also the real estate industry, office buildings, housing, and so on. All these are very much driving the economy. And whenever there's a glitch in the economy, at the time of the global financial crisis or the Asian financial crisis and so on, there's whole drive by the government, Chinese government, local and state, central, a concerted effort in order to ensure economic growth. And one major way to ensure this economic expansion is basically more money put into the fixed asset expansion. So you have, for example, this one comes from Chinese government statistics. Beijing, for example, having reached the share of fixed asset investment in the regional gross regional product, reaching almost about somewhere between 40 to 44% in the 2000 period, and that kind of is replicated to more or less to a lesser degree in other major Chinese cities. Sorry about the quality of the picture, but it kind of shows how, again, when you talk, out of the total investment in fixed assets, the importance of investment going into the real estate has been also increasing quite rapidly over the years. So when you look at the whole reform period from the early 1980s up until 2008, you can kind of see very steep increase in the share of real estate investment in the total fixed asset investment. And it's been kind of growing very steeply, and that kind of shows how towards the end of the 1990s and throughout the 2000s, how major cities like Beijing and Shanghai and all other second-tier cities which are trying to emulate the experience of the major cities have also been very much experiencing the real estate boom, the booming of the real estate industry during the last 10 years or 20 years or so. And you can kind of see how why that is going to be very important is all this drive to have urbanization, and at the same time the heavy investment going into expanding the infrastructure, and at the same time the growing importance of real estate industry. One major aspect to remember is, in terms of what is driving this kind of booming in such investment areas, is to understand the importance of the land issue in China. So I think to cut the long story short, the Chinese land ownership is kind of divided into two types of ownership structures. In cities, the urban lands are very much, not very much, is officially owned by the state. That is very much written, that's written in the Constitution, the Land Administration Act and so on, has been making this very clear that urban lands are owned by the state. And the administration, when urban lands have become more commodified, becoming essentially subject to trading, or the leasehold, the use right of the land, being detached from the ownership, and the use right becoming subject to trading in the emerging land market. So when you talk about the land becoming commodified, it's essentially the use right becoming subject to trading and changing hands. And that changing hands or the transaction of the land use right basically are administered by local government through devolution. So the local governments are becoming de facto landlords by means of having the power to transfer land use right from the state to end users like developers, for example. On the other hand, in rural areas, the land is collectively owned. It's not the state, it's the rural collectives which are the owners of the land. And therefore, in order to have the expansion of urban areas, in order to secure more land to bring them, in order to bring more lands into urban administration, there's inevitably this expropriation process by the urban government to take lands from the rural collectives. And once that expropriation is done, of course, the compensation given out to rural collectives and how the compensation is being spent within rural collectives is very much depending on how rural collectives are governed. But once this expropriation is being done, the land use change takes place, and the farmland, for example, changes its usage type into urban construction land. And once that is done, the land becomes subject to trading in the real land market. That also means there's in addition to that, one more important aspect is the local governments are given every incentive to facilitate this kind of transaction and also expropriation of farmlands, largely because land becomes a major source of financing urban development for local government. When you look at the kind of the local urban finance, the governmental financial system, all the revenues generated from collecting like VAT and so on are going into what is known as the budgetary revenue, which is basically shared between local government and the central government. So, for example, VATs, for example, collected from by local governments are about 75% of the VATs, for example, are handed over to the central government, and the other 25% is being retained by local government. Whereas another account, which is known as the extra budgetary revenue, is the one which is wholly retained by local government. All the revenues that come from transacting lands from the state to the end users, the land-related revenues and so on, are being retained by the local government as they are part of the extra budgetary, it doesn't say here, extra budgetary revenues. And these are solely owned and retained by local government without having to be transferred to the upper tier government or to the central government, for example. And that becomes a major source of financing urban development. And for example, when you look at the table here, Beijing or Hangzhou, a typical example in this case, and the amount of land-related revenues are more than the revenues that come from that usual government tax collection systems and so on. And Shanghai, Beijing, and so on also, a very high share of local revenues come from that extra budgetary revenues. And that aspect of financial system drives even further the local government's attempt to take more lands from rural collectives in order to transform these farmlands into construction lands, after which local government can start the process of selling the use right to developers. And by selling the use right to developers, the revenues going to be added to the local extra budgetary revenue account that can be used for other governmental projects. And that kind of becomes the basis for what I understand, the whole rise of the vertical accumulation or vertical urbanism within existing cities, where the existing lands which used to be occupied by different entities, I have to raise the volume now, during the planned economy era, or there's public sector and housing sites, or other lands which used to be occupied by the armies, military bases, or state-owned enterprises and so on, who used to be occupying these lands for many decades. These are all going to be, with the right emerging land market. That's already my alarm asking me to stop in 5 minutes. So let me just carry on for the next 5 minutes. The land is, especially in existing cities, becoming subject to a whole array of redevelopment activities in order to take the land from the existing users who used to occupy the land during the planned economy era, and the government taking these lands in order to resort to other developers who will initiate for very commercial, lucrative real estate projects. And at the same time, the city government will try to expand its territory to take more land from the farmers and bring them under their control, which kind of takes to the suburbanization drive by the urban government. And hence the whole political cities being on issue that you may see in many of these Chinese cities. The kind of revalorization of the existing urban lands in order to put them into a higher and better use, and in doing so, collect more revenues for urban government, at the same time create more livable environments from the Chinese government perspective. And at the same time, this also kind of takes us to the issue of the Chinese cities becoming the land of Chai. And Chai refers to this Chinese character, which actually means demolition. So whenever there's a demolition project to take place in order to redevelop existing neighborhoods, we have all these characters called Chai and being inscribed on the wall to indicate the building has been designated for demolition. And the whole neighborhood in particular, when this takes place, are going to be demolished in order to accommodate commercial housing projects, for example, or other office-related projects. I can spend 1 hour or 2 hours just using just this slide to explain what this means, but let me just simply say, when the land in existing city areas becomes subject to demolition, it's not simply a building coming down and a new building being erected. It involves the whole setup in the negotiation over property rights, the negotiations between local governments and the existing land users, who inherit the legacy of the planned economy era. So you have the socialist land masters, an expression used by U.T. and Singh in America, referring to those powerful state enterprises or the armies who used to occupy the very key spaces in cities and who regard themselves as de facto the owner of the land, and trying to do the same in the same manner as the local government. Or other public sector tenants or homeowners and so on, who are subject to the expropriation of their property ownership. And all these the struggles over who's going to be enjoying the final benefits of redevelopment becomes the whole becomes subject to the contestation and struggles when a building or a neighborhood comes down and becomes an ash. Let me just kind of give you 2 examples before I conclude. One is the example of Galaxy Soho. It's a good example to talk about the role of the state, especially the local state. Galaxy Soho is one, has anyone seen this one directly? Only one person. If you go to Beijing, go to in inner city Beijing, in the eastern part, it's standing right across the street from, and you can see, and very near the Ministry of Justice building actually, and that also location becomes an interesting issue to discuss. But Galaxy Soho is a brand new building, mixed-use office, residential, mostly office and retail and so on, built in the traditional Beijing, what used to be traditional Beijing neighborhood, designed by Zaha Hadid, a UK-based architect who is very much known internationally. It has received an award in 2013 for the design. When the award was given, the local NGO was complaining, and they wrote a letter saying this was built. The building of this structure was involving the demolition of the entire neighborhood, who was driven away, and this is very immoral. It's essentially unethical to have this brand new building, which kind of completely ignores the traditional fabric and also the livelihood of local people. And Zaha, the company, the architect, wrote a response saying, well, when he went there to carry out the design, there was nothing there. It was empty site. Or the residents were not there, or the buildings were demolished, and we were just invited. We just went there to carry out the design requested by the government. It kind of tells you what is really going on here. One, especially with regard to the role of the state. The state is, because of the whole complicated situations involving the demolition of a neighborhood, for example, the state itself is very much carrying out this task of clearing the site, doing the job for other investors to come in. And that kind of in the role of the state, basically as the provider of the site and the goods in order for investment to take place, becomes a whole important aspect to remember, and how that also makes the relationship between local residents and the local government more complicated. The second issue, before I conclude, is simply, you may probably remember all these talks involving the construction of high-speed rail connection. One interesting aspect is how the comparison was made between UK high-speed rail connection construction and the China's construction. Essentially, it was expected that about 20 plus years would be required to complete the whole construction between London connecting other northern cities in the UK. In China, for the same section, it took only 3.5 years, including expropriating land, doing the site assembly, and installing the rail networks and so on. 3.5 years, and it was kind of saying in the paper or in many other kind of experts, where UK is more democratic, and hence the whole negotiations, the court proceedings in order to negotiate over compensation, the local residents whose properties are being expropriated, going through all the legal procedures, and that will take a lot of time and so on. Whereas in China, that doesn't happen. It also shows how the whole drive of investment, how the state is very much behind the whole process. A very powerful state making use of their power and other apparatus to make this happen. I think that the state working to make things happen is probably one of the major strengths of Chinese economy, where the state is very much using a strong hands in the economy, becoming one of the major economic actors in doing so. So let me conclude here. I think where the question I was raising was, and as the title of the talk is whether the Chinese cities are different, but where I think we all know, whether or not Chinese cities are different from others is not probably the right question to ask, because every city will be quite different. Although we see London, Paris, or Tokyo, even within Western Europe, cities are quite different. If you really look deeply to find out how the cities have come about to exist, how the local contexts are quite different from one another. What is, however, quite interesting to identify is what kind of makes Chinese characteristic Chinese cities the way they perform nowadays. One is really the local government becoming an economic actor in the way I was kind of telling you just now, the importance of land issues, and the drive to increase the fixed asset investment. Very much business oriented to make things happen, especially to make sure GDP grows consistently. the past-dependent nature of China's state formation, especially what Kant was previously referring to, the issue of nationalism, still becomes very much an issue in Chinese society nowadays. Perhaps some critics even say nationalism will be replacing socialism, and that nationalism will become one of the major backbones sustaining the Chinese society during this reform period. Geographical scale becomes very much an issue, and the Chinese government very much making use of, or taking the advantage of huge territorial possession, and making sure that becomes the leverage when it comes to negotiating with Western economies. And that was also one issue when, that came out at the time of China being part of WTO early 2000. The strength of the party state becomes an issue, where the party state doesn't lose its popularity. It does lose popularity for some people, but nevertheless, especially when you talk about the rising middle classes, for example, where the buying power may come from in times to come. You may kind of have the one quick statement to make before I finish is, we all hear about the role of the middle class in Western societies, where the middle class has become the agent of social change. With the growing affluence, they pay more attention to democracy and ensuring the welfare of the society and so on, and willing to fight for such democratic rights. There's a bit of different understanding when it comes to East Asia. Not only China, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and so on, which were experiencing rapid economic development in the 1970s and 80s, when the state was very much driving these changes, like in the way China was doing. The middle class was expanding very rapidly, but this middle class expansion was very much driven by the state. The middle class was being nurtured by the state, and therefore the interest of the middle class were kind of tied together with the interest of the state. And therefore, although the middle class will have expanding notions of rights, and there comes the issue of the rights awareness that I was talking about, they may be very much aware of their property rights, protection of their wealth and properties and so on, or the individual right to speak out, or right to freedom and so on. But nevertheless, they may be hesitant to directly challenge the state. As long as the state itself is keeping its own policy to protect the wealth of the middle classes, the middle class will not be challenging or rising against the state in the way Western economies were seeing in recent past. And I think that makes a very interesting story to make when it comes to struggles between local residents and powerful state enterprises, or between local residents whose properties are being taken away by local government, and how they rise against the state. All these things will needs to be understood in the context of how certain population, urban residents, are seeing the rise of affluence, while some others are kind of losing out in this process. And therefore, when the people who are experiencing the rising affluence in this way in recent decades will not be so much supporting, was feeling a little bit sympathetic, but not very much seeing the loss of properties and rights experienced by poorer people or the migrants, something that is inevitable, or something that they may not be very much willing to intervene to make changes. I think I'll stop there and leave the rest for the break or the Q&A time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shin. Again, just to say, just picking up on this, the fact of this idea of 70% by 2030, that kind of phenomenal urbanization target, and the social cost of urbanization that shines through in what you just said to us. Really remarkable. I think what we do now, structure the day again, says that if you can quickly break for an informal cup of coffee, freshen up, and reconvene. When Hans and Matthew and myself we met for the first time, our intention was always to try and get history and urbanization to set up, kind of be the engine room and set up the context for the day on this discussion on China. But we were also mindful that as the day progressed, we would need to take a more nuanced view around urbanization and its impact on the countryside, the impact on environmentalism, and then bring to bear on the day Northstar's deep understanding of the modern Chinese consumer. So those are the three interesting packets, interesting sessions that we've got lined up after coffee. Please feel free, as we said, design the session as an informal opportunity to talk and approach people, ask the speakers any question that you have. There's a formal opportunity to do that right at the end. So a quick cup of coffee and we reconvene, and it's going to be Hans taking us into that home stretch.
There are some lines of
I'll put that report on for you.
Just